Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're delighted to be here tonight with our friends and partners at the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history, who are going to be sharing resources in the chat. As you can see, there are already some great things going on in the chat. Wherever you're watching from tonight, we encourage you to say hello. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know, what excites you about tonight's event. Certainly, if you were a student or an economist, or what's bringing here, we love to hear that. So make the chat lively and exciting. That's always fun for us. If you would like to ask questions, you may do so in the chat or via the Ask a Question tab at the bottom center of the screen. We're joined tonight by Anna Gifty Opoku-Agyeman, who is a researcher, writer, science communicator, and activist whose work has been featured in Teen Vogue, The New York Times, Slate Magazine, NPR, Fortune, Marketplace, and The Guardian. She's the co-founder of the Sadie Collective, the only nonprofit organization addressing the lack of Black women in economics and related fields. In 2020, she became the youngest recipient for the CEDAW Women's Rights Award by the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And she is the editor of the Black Agenda, Bold Solutions for a Broken System. And we are joined as well by Cliff Albright. And Cliff is a co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund and the BVM Capacity Building Institute, which builds community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power. BVM received national attention in 2017 when they helped mobilize Black voters during the U.S. Senate race between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. I know everybody in the South remembers that very pivotal fight. With much gratitude to your work in that. Since then, Cliff and the BVM team have traveled throughout 13 primarily Southern states in the blackest bus in America, energizing voters and exposing voter suppression. Cliff has contributed articles to the New York Times, Politico, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and several other outlets, and he has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and other networks. He also hosts a weekly radio show in Atlanta and has served as an instructor of African American studies at several universities. Cliff previously lived in historic Selma, Alabama, where he focused on bringing financial resources to Alabama's Black Belt region. Cliff attended Cornell University, where he obtained his BS in Applied Economics and an MPS in Africana Studies. He also has an MBA from the University of Alabama and a 2020 Soros Equality Fellow. So we are delighted to be here with both of you. We are very honored to get to help celebrate this book. We know it is going to be a major work. It's already getting a lot of buzz. I was just saying there's multiple NPR things happening, so much good stuff. I'm going to get out of the way and let's get right into it. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Anna.
Hello, Cliff. It is so nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We are really excited to be here today, to be in conversation with you all. This is really going to be probably the only tour stop, really, where I get to talk to someone who actually contributed directly to the book. And so Cliff Albright actually wrote the first essay in our public policy chapter concerning voting rights. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about why this book exists, of course, but I'll also be peppering off of Cliff's sort of thoughts around the book with respect to his own essay around voting rights and why it matters for this given moment. So Cliff, I'll hand it back to you.
Hey, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for this gift that you've given the country. And yeah, I'm just so glad to see such a comprehensive, thoughtful compilation from so many different subjects, because that's really reminiscent of even the way that we do our work at Black Voters Matter, right? We don't talk about voting as being a thing in and of itself. We talk about it as it's connected to all of these issues that our communities care deeply about. It's not just about a candidate or a party or about election cycle. It's about these issues, these issues that you've brought together in this book. Everything from economics to healthcare to, gender and voting. So the way that you've put this book together is really the way that we think about, this whole thing that we call, electoral organizing. So thank you for that.
Of course. Thank you. Again, the work is y'all's, and I'm so happy that I got to usher in just the work that you all have been doing tirelessly for so many years into the mainstream. And I know that you've been in the mainstream, so this is sort of like an addition or an addendum to the work that you're already doing.
Yeah, in some ways, I really feel like I've been out of the mainstream more often than not, because part of the reason that we do the work the way that we do, where we go to states that other people don't go to, and we go to communities and counties in those states that a lot of people just kind of overlook. Most people can't even find on a map. But part of the reason we do that is because, and when I say we, I'm talking mainly about me and my co-founder Latasha, and even my wife, April, who's kind of the silent third co-founder and also our legal director. But we lived in Selma, Alabama. Tasha grew up in Selma. April and I lived there for 10 years, and we were doing some incredible work. But it was in Selma, right? It was away from the mainstream. CNN didn't really care, except for one day out of the year. And that day is actually coming up in a couple of weeks, the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. But outside of that, we were just kind of on the margins. And so when we go to these communities now, we know what they're going through. We've been on the outskirts. We've been marginalized. We've been ignored. We've been under-resourced. That's why we put so much time and energy into trying to bring that connectivity and bring those resources to folks that we know are doing incredible work, electoral and racial justice organizing, but they're doing it oftentimes in isolation, in obscurity, and severely under-resourced.
Yeah, I love that. I think that your lived experience is exactly why this book exists, right? This idea of honoring the lived experience of Black experts, but also recognizing that your expertise is contextualized by that lived experience, right? Your push and your fight for voting rights as a co-founder of Black Voters Matter is heavily informed by the experiences you just quickly laid out just here. And so I think the first question I want to ask you, I know that we're going to be going back and forth this entire conversation, is why did you decide to contribute an essay to this book about voting rights? And ultimately, what inspired that, given the current political context that we're living through right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, that you can't have a book talking about the Black agenda that doesn't somehow involve, how we actually get action on our agendas, which is quite often, through our vote. But part of how we get action through our vote is by maintaining and really expanding voter access or voting rights, or what we really need to be talking about is about our voting power, because as we've learned, sometimes you can have voting rights but not actually have power. You can have the right to fill out a registration form, or even to go and participate in the act of voting, but still not have voting power. And so what we're about is how do we turn this into power? And so that's part of what I wanted to do in writing this essay, was to get us thinking about, how do we get closer to power? But the other thing that I wanted to do was to talk about just the history of what this struggle for voting rights and voting power has been about, and what lengths that we've had to go to in order to manifest it, because that's part of what will then inform us today in this current battle, to say, what, we sending a text is cool, and sending an email or making a phone call, but when you're battling for something that is such a thing that they've been trying to withhold from us from so long, we need to recognize that we might need to use some of those old school tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience. That's why I've actually been arrested 5 times in the past 7 or 8 months, fighting for voting rights in front of the Senate, in front of the White House. And, that's what it's going to take in order to finish this battle that's not yet over.
Yes, absolutely. There's something that's been asked of me quite a few times, how do we think about some of the solutions that are actually put into practice from the Black Agenda book? And one thing that I've emphasized time and time again is that voting rights is actually the catalyst for all of these solutions becoming reality, right? This idea of thinking about centering Black life in climate, in healthcare, in wellness, in tech, in education, and beyond all boils down to whether or not Black people actually have voting power, as you said in the last statement, right? With respect to how we think about decisions in America. And so what's really encouraging for me is having you all in this book sort of complementary to one another, sort of showing sort of the populace that, look, voting rights is part of this bigger picture of allowing us or unlocking this future that actually honors Black life and dignifies Black life beyond just, you know, the typical Black History Month honoring of certain heroes or even the occasional celebration on Juneteenth. So I love hearing that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting that you have this perspective, because I think, you know, I think all of these academic, you know, backgrounds or whatever, you know, so often they're in isolation, right? They're in silos, and you know, and I know as somebody, people associate me now with elections and politics and organizing, but as ER just read in my bio, my undergrad was actually in applied economics, you know,
Yes.
much like you. And so, you know, and folks within economics, applied or otherwise, you know, often we're really thought to be in a silo because so much of that work is based on some assumptions and, you know, theories of equilibrium and things of that nature that oftentimes don't exist. But it's just interesting that even coming out of that background, that you had the foresight to see, you know, the connections between all these different issues and avenues that it takes to really create a Black agenda. So it's really a radical notion, you know, so to speak, to really have brought all this together. And I think for this discussion in particular, you know, the merging of economics and politics. I was talking to somebody the other day about, they were asking me about, you know, the old school debates between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, you know, which was fundamentally, or at least in part, about this tension between, you know, economic development and political development and our human rights and civil rights and all of that. So it's just interesting to have all this come together in this book.
Absolutely. And I would say, to your last point, right, those two things are complementary if you think about it. And this book sort of illustrates that beautifully, where it's like in every single chapter, and then this wasn't intentional, y'all, there is an economist in every single chapter, specifically a Black economist. And I think it's because at the end of the day, the empirical analysis that informs the policies that we're seeing in DC and beyond are oftentimes informed by economists and people who are able to see the numbers in aggregate and say, here's what we need to do to get this certain outcome. And so it was really important to bring the economic lens in conjunction with the voting rights lens, in conjunction with the healthcare lens, et cetera, to say, look, there's actually numbers that also back up this sort of radical agenda around, you know, honoring and dignifying Black life. It's not just about doing the right thing, though that's by far the most important thing about this, but it's also recognizing that this is the most efficient thing, the most effective thing. There's an essay in the book that's called Black Women Best. I've shouted out at every single tour stop. It's by Janelle Jones and Angela Hanks. And Janelle Jones is actually, or she was, the first Black woman to occupy the office of the chief economist in the Department of Labor as of last year. And so the essay basically says, look, the best outcome for Black women is a better outcome for everyone else. And if you think about it, you can read the entire book and see, wait a minute, if we are centering the conversations and the problems and the solutions around Black life, then we actually see everybody else's outcomes and everybody else's livelihoods improve as a result.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that, because, you know, I was actually just on another panel where I was talking about that exact same issue. Because here you are, you got a book called The Black Agenda, right? You know, I got an organization called Black Voters Matter. You know, people want to know, well, why is it just Black, right? And oftentimes we, you know, I say exactly the same thing that you just said. When Black folks advance our voting rights all throughout history, when we advance our voting rights, everybody benefits. This entire country has moved forward. Think about all of the movements around voter access that have benefited from Black struggle on voting rights. The women's right to vote, right? Women's suffrage. Folks with disabilities have had their rights expanded and their access expanded because of our efforts. Folks with language barriers have had their access expanded. Even in terms of age, there was a time where you were old enough to be in a war, but you weren't old enough to vote. But that was advanced by this ongoing struggle led by Black folks to expand access to the vote. And so exactly what you said about all these disciplines, the Black health, when Black health gets benefit, the entire countries get better. When Black workers are doing better, all workers are doing better. You know, when Black education is doing better, everybody's education is doing better. And so that's why we've really got to be comfortable centering unapologetically, you know, our community, because that's been our history. We benefit this entire country when we get our due rights. But any democracy where we don't have our vote is not a real democracy.
That's
any democracy, any healthcare system where we don't have equitable access to healthcare is not a legitimate healthcare system. Any education system where our kids can't learn about themselves, so-called critical race theory, right? Where our kids can't learn about themselves, and our kids don't have a right to feel good about themselves, right? And so all of this anti-Blackness affects every system eventually. Even when it starts targeted at us, it spills over. And for all the rest of these disciplines to do well, we got it. You know, it's like the color purple. Till you do right by us, you're not going to be able to do right by the rest of the country.
That's exactly right. I really want to like build on that point, and then I'm going to pivot into your essay a little bit more specifically. You know, one big thing I've been telling people is that this book makes an unequivocal case for the humanity of Black life to be fully realized, right? And what we're really asking in this book, and I would say it's really the experts who are asking this, is to think about how Black life has been humiliated, undervalued, underestimated, and whatever it may be for centuries, right? And the cost that is borne by everyone because Black life has been such a devalued thing as part of America, and I would argue the West's entire history. And so one thing I've mentioned, this is a question that's come up from Dr. Keisha and Blaine. She asked me, you know, you're a Ghanaian American. How do you sort of play a role in bringing these voices together? And I say, you know, at the end of the day, the Black American struggle for freedom and civil rights ends up being essentially a blueprint for the rest of the Black diaspora across the world. If you are not able to get human rights, there's no way I can be here, right? The only reason I'm here is because people actually push the boundary of civil rights. And so I think it is incredibly representative that we're here today. We're talking virtually in Atlanta, right? Because this is really where a lot of the struggle was sort of built. And that struggle was then replicated in even my home country, Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah was talking with folks like Marcus Garvey and Martin Luther King Jr., right? So this idea of Black life being, you know, humanized and valued, that is the ethos of this book. And I love that you kind of talk about this in the modern era. I want to sort of bring up a statistic that you mentioned in your essay. You say more than 400 bills with provisions to restrict voting access have been introduced in 49 out of the 50 states in 2021 alone.
That's right.
2021, y'all. And then you went ahead and said all of these bills have been introduced by legislators that are mainly controlled by the Republican Party. Why is this statistic important, and why do we need to be concerned about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows a couple of things. You know, one, it shows like just the depth and breadth of the attacks coming out of the big lie. Like we gotta be real clear about, you know, where a lot of this is coming from. It's coming out of this big lie that, you know, this rampant voter fraud and that there's all these things that are needed in order to you know, control, add more security and restrict access to the vote. Although I will say this, that notion of the big lie is not something that was unique to the orange guy that used to be in the White House who got impeached twice. You know, it wasn't just unique to him, because really when we look at it, this notion of needing to deal with voter fraud really got its origins more like in after the 2000 election in Florida, right? If people recall,
I remember that.
Folks were, you know, after that election where Black folks in particular were saying, look, this election was wrong. There were Black people that were disenfranchised wrongfully, and just the number of Black folks that were disenfranchised could have tilted that Florida election. But what came out of that debate was, oh, you know what? Instead of talking about voter suppression, let's talk about these fraud issues that we saw happening. And that's what it led to the Bush administration started to talk about fraud and the need for more security. That led to the Ohio election in the year 2004, where again, Black folks were disenfranchised. So this notion of sacrificing access, voter access, in the name of this made up mythical voter fraud problem, that's something that had been building up in this Republican Party and in this country for longer than Trump. Trump just took it to a whole nother level, took it on steroids. And of course, it's led to this wave of voter suppression bills that you were just talking about.
Yeah, Cliff, I want you to sort of illustrate for those who are listening in, why does it matter that Black folks make it to the ballot? Because I think a lot of times when we're talking about this issue of Black voters matter, obviously you're going to get people who say, but all voters matter, right? So I think it's important to recognize that it's actually, I always say it like this. What happens to Black people, especially Black Americans in the context of the United States, is almost always a precursor to what will happen to the nation as a whole. So I can give you a very clear example of this, right? Again, I was like in 5th grade, so this is all like me learning from school and stuff like that. So the 2008 financial crisis, if you speak to Dr. William Spriggs, who was a professor at Howard University at the time, he says, look, Black economists saw 2008 and 2006 in our own communities, where foreclosures were going up, where we saw predatory loaning lenders, preying on vulnerable families. We saw, inflation going on, and all of these things were happening in our communities, but no one took us seriously enough until it hit everyone else. And so I want you to kind of give a sense of, why does it matter that Black voters make their way to the ballot, but not only make their way to the ballot, that they have power at the ballot as well?
Yeah, for a bunch of reasons. One, when the more that you have Black folks involved, and I'll even say Black, brown, younger voters, then the more progressive electorate that you wind up getting, right? Gotcha. And as we've said, that winds up benefiting everyone. And so when we can't have our voices heard, and when you've got people who are in power because they have suppressed our votes, what winds up happening is that you've got elected officials who have picked their voters instead of the voters picking the elected officials. And you've got people who are isolated from really any kind of accountability. Not only are they not accountable to us as Black folks who they've suppressed, they're not even accountable to their own voters. And so just take, for an example, take an issue like, gun safety, right? Which is always a topic and a critical topic in this country. But something like common sense background checks. You can't get 90% of this country to really agree on anything. And yet somehow 90% of the country can agree on background checks. But you can't get no background checks passed through Congress because you've got a Congress that is so isolated from its voters, that is in such safe districts that it's no longer accountable even to their own voters, let alone to Black folks. So the entire country suffers because of the structural flaws that were created based on anti-Blackness. Same thing, take COVID as an example. We are still in a pandemic that this country has no business being in, but you've got elected officials that are so isolated that they're able to pursue policies that are literally killing thousands. We're still losing 3,000 people per day. But people are acting like we just tired of COVID, like COVID's over or whatever. But if you're not clear about the way that voter suppression, I always say this, voter suppression is not a white collar crime. Voter suppression is not a victimless crime. Voter suppression is a violent crime because it has violent impacts on our lives in terms of our health, in terms of our economics and our jobs. Voter suppression is a violent crime that winds up impacting everybody, even if it was originally targeted and is used most often against Black folks.
Yes, this is incredibly powerful. And it reminds me of an essay in the climate chapter, actually 2 essays. We had an essay by Dr. Marshall Shepard that opened up the book. And he says, look, where you live matters. Your zip code matters, not just to the climate of your literal neighborhood, but also to your access and to opportunity and to voting, right? And he talks about how there needs to be actual legislation that speaks to how do we create wealth in such a way that doesn't disenfranchise entire communities of Black people and brown people, quite frankly, right? Latinx and Native Americans are right there, right? And I would say the other thing too is that Abigail Thomas, in her essay, she says, look, the way that we're thinking about the climate justice movement and how it relates to all different facets of society, we're forgetting a very critical key component, and that is voting rights. How voting rights are executed in this country will be actually determinant of how the climate crisis plays out, right? This idea of having Black folks vote with climate in mind, they can't vote for climate in mind if they can't get to the ballot, if they don't have power at the ballot. Even if they have power at the ballot, it's somehow disenfranchised or undermined because Black voters are not seen as human or not seen as citizens within this country. And so it's imperative that exactly what Cliff is talking about, and this is what the book kind of makes a case for, there are intersections between the different areas of policy that we are seeing currently that at the end of the day, at the crux, it's all about undervaluing Black life. And if you think about it from that perspective, then you say, wait a minute, the way to unlock progress, the way to unlock, hope, the way to unlock benefits for everyone across the country is by ensuring that Black life is fully honored.
That's right. No, it's that simple, right? This ain't rocket science. Like, that has got to be, your starting point, or else you can't get to the answers that we need to get to. I often say that the same cracks that we're seeing in this democracy now, and in every system, whether it's the political system, the economic system, health, education, the same cracks. I mean, it's the 1619 theory, right? That the same cracks that were at the founding of this nation that was first and foremost created off the theft of land from one group of people and the kidnapping and enslavement of another group of people, that those original fissures, that original sin, that original structural weakness is basically the same thing that we're seeing today, right? Even the way that power was defined, who had the right to vote? You had to be a white man with money or property, and Christian for that matter, right? But that's and then when you look at who cast most of the votes a couple of weeks ago when they voted not to give us voting rights, right? Basically, it was that same demographic. You handful of folks, a little bit different. Yeah, you got Senator Warnock in there. Yeah, you got a handful of women, but it's basically that same demographic that is still blocking progress for everybody else. And so it's really not rocket science on what it takes to reverse this. The question is, can we come together to make it happen? Do we have the agenda, right? The unified agenda, which is what this book is about, on which we're basing our work. And are we going to have an honest discussion about the things that are plaguing this country in each of these disciplines that you outlined?
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about why this book exists. I think we've kind of touched on it throughout this entire conversation, but for those who are listening, the Black agenda was really birthed out of the first month of the pandemic, when I noticed that Black experts, even though that they were having conversations on my Twitter timeline and on social media, were not necessarily being amplified by the mainstream media, places like CNN, places like New York Times, etc. And so for me, I had one question, especially in the economics realm. I said, do Black economists matter? And then I expanded that question to say, do Black experts matter? And what I also recognized was that having a little bit of a platform on social media, people saw me as the most familiar face. And so I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, if we're able to bring Black experts into the mainstream in a major way, then perhaps those individuals will be the ones who are reached out to. Because I'm just a student, right? Like, I have thoughts, sure. If you want to ask me about Janet Yellen, I'll give you my 2 cents. But at the end of the day, there are people like Cliff, like Miss Latasha Brown, like Dr. Dania Francis, like Benga Ajolore, who have been doing this work for a very, very long time and ought to be centered. And so this is really where that book was born out of. I'd like to hit on something that you mentioned in your essay, if you don't mind. We're going back to the history as you suggested earlier. You said something in the essay around sort of the history of voting in America, which I thought was really interesting. You said there was the introduction of grandfather clauses, which exempted citizens from voting barriers if their ancestors had the right to vote before the Civil War. But that basically disenfranchises all Black people in America at the time. So talk me through sort of what were these codes and how do those codes sort of manifest today in the modern reality that we're living through?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I want to point out is, Jen, you touched on it a little bit, is that, a lot of these codes, we often think that the denial of the vote only came after Reconstruction, right? And there's a lot of truth to that. But there was also this denial of the vote, and I talk about this in the essay, that happened even before the Civil War to Black folks who were in the North who actually had the right to vote, and were voting. Especially when you talk about like free Black folks in the North, places like Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts, where, we were actually doing some voting. But what you saw happen as you go throughout, later into the late 1700s, into the 1800s, that by the time you get to the Civil War, 19 and 24 states in the North, the Black folks could no longer vote. So you actually saw this reversal of voting rights even before the Civil War, where Black folks in the North who had been able to vote slowly lost that right to vote in the North. I'm talking about the North now, right?
Right.
Then what happens is the Civil War, 15th Amendment, we get the right to vote. Then Reconstruction ends, right? Tilden Hayes Compromise. And as I always say in history, anytime in history you see the word compromise, you pretty much know we're the ones who were the compromise. Tilden Hayes Compromise, Missouri Compromise of 1850, three-fifths compromise. Anytime you hear that compromise, Black folks are basically catching the short end of the stick. But after Reconstruction and the Tilden Hayes Compromise, then we see our voting rights being taken away. We see the grandfather clauses that you were talking about. We see the literacy test and all of that. So why is this important, as you asked, in terms of today? There's this whole discussion around Jim Crow 2.0. And some people say, oh, y'all are exaggerating and it's not that bad. And, Jim Crow was about, legal segregation and Blacks only and whites only. And that was true in terms of public accommodations and school and all that. But in terms of voting, Jim Crow was always this thing that on paper applied to everybody. Technically everybody had a poll tax. Technically everybody had, a literacy test. Technically everybody had, even the grandfather clause itself, they had to create that because they couldn't specifically say race. So instead of specifically saying race, it was about, what could your grandfather do? It had the same impact. That's what Jim Crow looked like in terms of voting then, and that's what's happening now. Even if the voter ID law or the denial of the closing polling places or getting rid of drop boxes, none of those have a big old Black only sign on them, right? But in practice, that's what it is, which makes this just as much Jim Crow as the Jim Crow original voting policies were. They don't come out and say, they don't say race, but even now, some of these court decisions show that they target Black folks with what they say, surgical like precision. And so that's what this Jim Crow looks like today. That's why knowing this history is so important, because if we don't know that history, and more importantly, if we don't know that history hasn't been in a straight line from no voting rights to voting rights, it's been up and down from voting rights in the North, lost our voting rights, got it back after Reconstruction, lost it again because of Jim Crow, got it back in 1965, and now we've been losing it ever since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act with Shelby in 2013, and then some more recent decisions, including a decision just this week, which is going to have disastrous impacts. That's not a straight line. It ebbs and it flows and it goes ups and down. And if we don't recognize that, then we can't fight against it.
See, one thing I want to note here is the contrast, right? You talk about how voting rights for Black folks in America, and more specifically Black Americans, ebbs and flows. But recognize that voting rights for white Americans, basically a straight line,
That's
right?
That's
so
right.
If we're looking at, like, I'm a math girl. So if we're looking at a graph, we're seeing, zigzags superimposed on a constant line. And people are wondering why this matters and why this is such a huge issue. If my ability to vote is something that changes with the times and your ability to vote doesn't, there's something fundamentally unequal there. And the question is, how do we move forward as a country when I have a voice in certain times in history and you have a voice throughout history, right? So these are the kind of questions that Black Voters Matter, Cliff Albright, Miss Latasha Brown, and so many others are attempting to answer. I want to kind of get in a little bit to some of the solutions, right? We kind of saw some of these solutions carried. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to comment on that because I think that is absolutely brilliant, and I'm going to borrow from that because that straight line, as we know in science and math, you know, that's symptomatic of a constant slope, right?
That's exactly right.
You got one group that have a constant, right? They got a constant slope, they got a constant right, and then you got another one who's, I guess you could say, it's variable. And we're the variable.
Yes.
Like our stuff is variable, right? It's dependent on a whole bunch of other stuff. And anytime you got that situation, you don't have a real democracy. In fact, that's not even a matter of civil rights. That's a matter of human rights.
That's exactly right. Oh, that just started chill down my spine, Cliff. That's amazing. So I really want us to focus these last few moments, or the latter half of this, talking about the solutions. And again, if you have questions, I know some people were expecting to hear more from me about why this book came together, but really I would love to focus this more on Cliff and his work and his essay. Let's talk a little bit about the solutions. You mentioned in your essay that there's 2 acts that need to be passed in order to ensure voting rights. Can you talk about those acts, and can you talk about how they're going to ensure voting rights for all?
Yeah, you know, and I think at the time I wrote the essay, I think the first one was still the For the People Act, which is what it was called earlier in 2021. And at some point it got modified mainly because of good old Joe Manchin in West Virginia. But it got modified and it became this Freedom to Vote Act, which still had a lot of good stuff in it, right? He changed up some stuff, but it still had a lot of good stuff in it. And so you got the Freedom to Vote Act, and then you had the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And then those two were actually just merged. That's what happened a couple of weeks ago when they finally got around to having the vote in the Senate. So those 2 bills actually became one package. But I'm going to talk about them as the 2 pieces, because the 2 pieces of it did kind of unique things. On the one hand, you had, in fact, I'm going to start with the John Lewis Act, because what it basically did was it sought to, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, it sought to restore the parts of the Voting Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, that had been weakened and gutted by the Supreme Court. Most importantly, the pre-clearance provision that's in the Voting Rights Act. And real quickly, for those who don't know, that's the part of the Voting Rights Act that says, look, there are certain states and certain parts of states that, because of their history of voter suppression, that before they do any changes, whether that's changing the days of voting, changing polling places, changing their maps, changing whether they're a single district or a multi-representative district, before they do any of these changes, that's got to get pre-cleared by the federal government, more specifically by the Justice Department. That pre-clearance provision was a huge part of the 65 Act, and it allowed many things that these states had continued to try to do over the years to be blocked. That provision was eliminated in 2013 when the Supreme Court and the Shelby decision. So part of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act really was designed to restore that, right? So that's that part. Then you got the Freedom to Vote Act, which basically seeks to establish new benchmarks, new standards for voting. It guarantees a certain number of days for early voting. It deals with racial and partisan gerrymandering to get rid of that. It actually dealt with creating a pathway in every state for people to get their rights from felony disenfranchisement, to get their rights restored, unlike the current situation where in some states you might never get it back. In another state, you might get it back, but you got to go through all this rigmarole or whatever. It established a clear practice that says once you've done your time, you get your rights back, the easy process and all of that. So the Freedom to Vote Act established stands. It actually makes Election Day a national holiday. It dealt with some campaign finance issues. And so it dealt with these new standards to open up access to the vote, whereas the other part, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, sought to put in that pre-clearance. And if you had those 2 things, if you had some standards that every state has to do, and then you got this pre-clearance piece that says before you try to do anything, you got to get it cleared, those two pieces together give you a pretty good framework to protect voting rights. That's why we're fighting so hard to get those passed.
Yeah. And let's go back even to the analogy we talked about before. If we see white voting rights as being some sort of constant line, then the variability that's in Black voting rights is essentially somewhat corrected by the acts that Cliff is talking about in this essay and beyond, right? And so it's about ensuring that there is legislation that actually protects the act to vote by Black folks in America. And one thing I want to mention here is that there's actually a complementary essay to Cliff's essay called, it's sort of talking about we need legislative and policy wonks who understand how discrimination pops up in the different bills and policies that are proposed in Washington. It's written by Dr. Dania Francis, who's a public policy economist. And she says, look, we need individuals who are well-versed in the kinds of legislation that hits the floor, that hits Congress. And we need to ensure that those individuals can say, look, that's discriminatory, that's racist, that's sexist, that's homophobic, that's transphobic. And the intersection of all those things to ensure that people are not being disenfranchised by the types of bills and laws that are passed for all.
Yeah, and there's a third act that I'd like to talk about. There's a couple of other acts that I'd like to talk about. We need to talk about expanding the court, because at the end of the day, even after we get the voting rights legislation passed, and we will get it passed, but even after that, we still got to deal with this court, which is increasingly showing itself to be a court nothing more than a bunch of partisan hacks right now that really just went out their way in order to strike down some new maps in Alabama, and make it easier for Republicans to try to regain Congress in these midterm elections. So we're going to have to deal with that court. And so we need to have an honest discussion about expanding the court. But there's another act that I think is really important, especially as we think about how we go from just voting rights to voting power. And that's this thing called the Fair Representation Act. It's not getting a lot of discussion. It hasn't really even been discussed in the whole voting rights discussions that's been taking place. But, you know, it's actually something that's very similar to some of the theories that Lonnie Guinier used to talk about. For those who don't remember, Lonnie Guinier, civil rights, great lawyer and civil rights advocate and law professor. But, you know, she was nominated in the 90s by Bill Clinton to be the assistant attorney general for civil rights. And her nomination was pulled because they started to attack her because of some of her writings. And some of her writings dealt with this issue of the Voting Rights Act and proportional representation and rethinking and reimagining what does majority rule look like and what does it mean. And people attacked her because they said, oh, she's a quota queen. She just won black quotas and you know, she doesn't believe in majority rule. And what she was talking about wasn't just about not believing in majority rule, but it was about redefining what does that really look like, especially in a country where you've got racial and ethnic divisions. And as she said, when you've got that situation, majority rule is an unreliable instrument. And so what she was saying, though, was bumping heads against people who, including Chief Justice John Roberts, the current Chief Justice of the court. There are people who believe that voting rights is just about, do you have the right to go in and register? Do you have the right to cast your vote? And that's it. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you actually have power or whether or not you actually have representation. As long as you have that right to vote, it doesn't matter if you never actually have a chance to have your views represented. Right. You got a chance to fill out the form and just be happy that you got that much. Don't worry about power. Just be glad you got, quote unquote, the right to vote. We've got to move the discussion forward, and that's going to require rethinking fundamentally what majority rule looks like and what these mechanisms are. And this Fair Representation Act does it by getting us to look at how is it, you know, getting rid of single member districts or not single member districts, but these winner take all districts where if you don't get that 50%, then your views are basically invisible. So creating a system where if you win 35% of the vote, then you can actually get close to 35% of representation. So that causes having to rethink how we even think about these districts and the shapes of these districts. But guess what? that gets rid of the whole gerrymandering discussion. So that act hasn't gotten a lot of discussion, but it's something that we really need to take a closer look at if we're going to really go beyond just voting rights and get more close to this notion of voting power.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for those who aren't for not familiar with sort of how lines are drawn around the country and how that affects voting rights, the way I understand it, and please correct me, Cliff, if I'm wrong in any way, is that historically there have been laws that have essentially baked racism into how neighborhoods are constructed, right? So we are all familiar with this concept of white flight, where Black folks from the South are moving into the North, and people left the suburbs, or left the cities, excuse me, to move to the suburbs. And so it essentially sucked out all the resources in those respective areas. But there were also laws that drew essentially where resources could be allocated, right? And so it kind of goes back to some of the different sort of topics that come into play with respect to the book, right? So for example, Dr. Monica McLemore, who is a nursing researcher, says, look, there was a report that came out in the 1910s that showed that 200,000 more Black physicians would have existed had this report had not sort of excluded or been used to shut down minority serving and HBCU institutions that were building these physicians up, right? This also reminds me of, again, the climate chapter, in which literal neighborhoods are hotter because of how the lines are drawn, right? And all of these things play a role into, when we talk about voting, when we talk about voting power, it's not even just about, oh, I want my voice to be heard. It's, oh, I want my life to be honored. Oh, I want my life to be seen in the context of policy making, the context of policy decisions that are being made on behalf of me and my community. And so it's not enough just to get the ballot. It's not enough just to register to vote. We actually have to go beyond that, as what Cliff is saying, to ensure that voting essentially becomes a catalyst for the types of bold solutions that are illustrated in this book and beyond.
Yeah, no, definitely. And what you were saying there, I used to have this debate in my mind all throughout grad school. I bounce around like which is the most important aspect of racism for us to deal with, right? Is it education? Because once we change people's education, and we can change some of these solutions, right? Is it voting, right? And what I often would come back to is this question of place, this question of housing, right? And the lines that you were just talking about, because it plays such a role in everything, right? And because of where we are spatially and geographically, it dictates what school you go to. It dictates your voting rights. It even, as you said, it dictates your health results and your health disparities and your exposure to environmental justice concerns. So a lot of times I would come back to this issue of place and housing and location as being like, the thing that if we could fix that, then we might be able to fix everything else. But as soon as I would conclude that, then I'd go right back around in the circle to we got
there's something else.
Money right. That's right.
Yes, and one thing I'll also say to that too, Cliff, is that I was speaking with an interviewer sort of early on in the book promotion process, and they said, "Did you notice that criminal justice comes up in every single section of the book?" And I said, "You're right. There's at least one essay in every single section of this book that brings up the fact that being Black in America is illegal. It is criminalized, right? The literal act of being Black." And so if you think about that in conjunction with what Cliff just talked about, it's the fact that Blackness as it stands in America is criminalized. And so because it's criminalized, you have two options. You either live in a subpar part of America, right? Or you're in prison, right? This is sort of the idea of how the justice system or how the overall system views Blackness and how it manifests in the policy space. And so the way that we think about acting or activating solutions around that, in my opinion, does begin with voting rights. And so one thing I want to sort of get into a little bit more is, you talk a bit about how we need direct action, how this is going to, require good trouble, as the late John Lewis says, right? And so what does it look like in our own communities to stir up good trouble around voting rights? How can we do that in the communities that we currently reside in?
Well, let me say this, because I do want to get to that, but let me say this real quick, because
Absolutely.
what you just said is so important about the criminalization and Blackness, equaling that. Because going back to what I said about the original sin, I mean, that's what crime, it was a replacement for slavery, right? This is what we all know about the 13th Amendment. It gets rid of slavery, except for what? As punishment for committing a crime. And so much of what we experience is a result that they basically took away slavery and then just replaced it with this over criminalizing an entire race, which then impacts crime, it impacts education, it impacts voting rights and felony disenfranchisement. But slavery just simply being replaced with criminalizing is I mean, it's as American as apple pie, right? So what you just said was really important. But in terms of like the actions that we need to be taking, yes, I mean, we need, and I say this all the time, everybody's got a role to play. Not everybody's going to do nonviolent civil disobedience. Not everybody's going to get arrested outside the Senate building or whatever, but everybody's got a role to play. It might be that you're involved in civil disobedience. It might be that you're involved in a rally and that you're supporting the civil disobedience that's taking place, that you're an observer. It might be that you're the one who's bringing the cultural gifts, right? Bringing the song. If my dear friend, Sister Latasha Brown, my co-founder, said she'd probably break out into a song right about now. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to you. But, you might be the person who brings the song to the mix, that brings that cultural upliftment, right? You might be the person that draws the artwork for the signs of something that's at the rally. You might be the person that's doing the text and the email. Everybody's got a role to play. And a lot of these roles have to be played at the local level. You might be the person that's going to the local board meeting, because some of this voter suppression is taking place at the very local level, at the county board of elections, where they're making a decision of which polling places to close, right? Or what the hours are going to be, or some of these other decisions that they make about early voting days and all of that. So your role might be to go to those meetings. If you're worried about gerrymandering, then maybe your role is to go to the state capitol where some of these hearings are taking place, and so that you can see and hear and maybe even participate in public comment. Although in many of these states, what they call public comment is really nothing, because they give you 30 seconds or 60 seconds for you to comment on a map process. They don't really want public comment, but that might be your role. There's a role for everybody to play, but whatever your role is going to be, and I beg of you, if you remember nothing else, get connected to some organization that is doing this work. Get connected. It doesn't have to be Black Voters Matter, although if you want to, you could text voting rights to 25225. Text voting rights to 25225. That'll get you connected to us, because we're in the midst of a campaign. We're saying 1 million voters for voting rights. We're trying to get 1 million people to take the pledge, sign a petition, and promise to engage in some action to get our voting rights. And we're going to be talking about that a lot when we go to Selma in a couple of weeks, and when we do the Selma to Montgomery March. But it doesn't have to be us. It can be League of Women Voters. It can be People for the American Way. It can be the NAACP. You could get involved and support the LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, and some of the great legal work that they're doing. Get involved. It can be a local organization. It could be, if you've got a church that's activist, and there's not enough churches that are activists, but if you've got one, then do it through them. Or guess what? Make them be activists. How about that? But get involved with some organized body so that you can do this work. Because when we come together, whatever we do, when we do it together, when we work together, we win.
Wow. That was incredibly powerful. And thank you so much, Daniel. I hope we addressed your question. We have only about 2 minutes left, but I want to say, first and foremost, thank you so much for your work. I'm trying not to cry. I just think it's incredibly impactful and so important. You help sort of transform the nation in some ways around how we think about voting rights and the importance of voting rights. But if you've actually inspired my generation to be more vocal about our rights and how we go about obtaining those rights and supporting initiatives that are also doing this. And that's to anybody who's around my age. I'm 25 for those who don't know, right? If you're 25 or younger, like, there's so much you can do. Don't feel like you're limited by your age or even by the access that you currently have. If you feel passionate about something, if you feel passionate about something like voting rights or climate change or healthcare wellness or any of the number of topics that are addressed in this book, I encourage you, I implore you to really push for those things. And you never know how far you will go as you link with other people in your community and as you support the cause that hopefully will lead to the dignification and humanization of Black life. Thank you so much, Cliff, for everything. I'm so grateful for your essay. So grateful for you and Miss Latasha and Stacey Abrams and everybody in Georgia who is doing such great work on the ground and across the nation. And we hope that we will hear from you soon. Please check out Cliff's new op-ed in The Guardian today. It's about these same topics. And for those who are interested in purchasing the book, please check out the book from Charis Circle or any of the other bookstores that you hope to support during Black History Month. Thank you so much, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This was an amazing event. I cannot believe that you are 25 years old. What the inspiration. So for folks out there who say they can't make a difference, young folks can make a difference for sure. So thank you, Cliff, for all of your work and dedication. Just click this teal button, folks who are watching at home, to buy the Black Agenda Bold Solutions for a Broken System directly from Charis. It really does help us a lot. You can also encourage your local library to carry it. So I'm sure it'll be at the Auburn Avenue Research Library, but your local public library, try and get it in the library, try and get it in your school library, because that is also how these important ideas get into people's hands. So please do that wherever you buy books. And I hope for both of you that you stay safe and well, and continue to have much success in your journey. Thank you so much.
And sorry, really quick, I want to say one last thing. Sorry, y'all. There's an event tomorrow for those who are interested in tuning in and hearing about policy conversations at the Urban Institute. It's virtual. So just check out blackagendabook.com/events to register. Thank you so much, y'all.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
All right, y'all.